So today we're going to talk about an area that my collaborator Maureen Naman, who's at Cornell Tech, and I've been thinking about for a couple of years. Every once in a while, we get to go on sabbatical and try to think big thoughts. And the big thought that came out of my last sabbatical was this idea of what we're going to call AI-mediated communication, which I'll get into a little bit more. But I want to just recognize my colleague Maureen Naman, who I've been thinking about with us a lot. And also Xiao Ma, who is a PhD student there at Cornell Tech, now works at Google, who actually came up with the very term AI-mediated communication. And as we're going to see, it's a little bit of a play on something you'll all be more familiar with, which is computer-mediated communication. So I'll dive in. Towards the end, I'll recognize more of the collaborators that have done a lot of the actual empirical work here. And I'll just start by saying this is one of the areas I'm really excited about. We have some new projects that aren't fully baked yet, so I'll just share some sort of early insights into them. But I'm really excited to hear any feedback, whether it be during the question and answer period, or please feel free to email me, or you can see my my Twitter handle there. Let me know. I'd love to get any further ideas. I think this is a really exciting new area for me, anyways. So let's dive in. Imagine for a moment that you're going to go travel to a conference. This is obviously pre-pandemic. And Unju and I were talking, this is not what I normally look like. This is my pandemic look with a big beard and long hair. There's no barbers here in California. It's all shut down. So imagine in the pre-times that you were going to go to Glasgow to go to a conference. And you were going to get an Airbnb. And you looked at this profile here. Hi, I'm Rick. Find out when he joined, and you learn that he's a student living in Glasgow. He loves traveling. He loves nature, going and finding new things. And he has a little quote here: "Life is what happens to you while you're busy making other plans." So it's quite nice, quite typical Airbnb. And the question that you'll be faced with, and we are faced with this, countless times as we make decisions online about, other people and the services they'll provide, whether it's, getting in a car share or buying some shoes or staying in a hotel with online reviews. These are decisions we make all the time. So you already have automatically, using a lot of systems that we've evolved over a long time, made decisions about whether Rick is a trustworthy person or not. And those decisions that you've made really quickly about whether Rick was a trustworthy person could be modified somewhat if I told you that, in fact, Rick didn't write that, but that instead Airbnb or a similar kind of company had provided Rick with some technology to help him write it. And instead what happened was Rick said, well, I'm going to enter, my name is Rick. I'm a student. I live in Glasgow. I love travel. I like France. Or even more likely, in the near future, Rick gives this technology access to some of his social media accounts. And the technology is able to take a look at the things that he's written in his social media accounts and extract things that the system thinks is important about Rick that would be shared with other people. And not just anything that was being shared. Let's imagine that this technology was being used to optimize the degree to which Rick came across as trustworthy. So now Rick hasn't written anything. He hasn't done any of the communication that we would typically think of as communication. Instead, some AI system, which has been used to essentially optimize his communication for some kind of interpersonal outcome, basically appearing trustworthy. So this is the idea of AI-mediated communication, that this is sort of a possibility. And it's not just a possibility anymore. It's actually, very, very common. And I'll show you some examples in a moment. But it's quite different from what we're used to when we think about my primary area of research, computer-mediated communication. In that world, and this goes back to the 70s and 80s, where people first started studying how communication worked when it went through computers, going back to Short and go back to Kiesler and Walther and all those people. They were really interested in what happens when computers take my message, say to Unju Lee, and they move from Jeff as the sender and they send them over to Unju. So it could be text, it could be a piece of video, it could be a photo, but the computer is basically just a pipeline, and it's taking it in this amazing way where I didn't have to be on a direct phone call or that, but it's moving it through a network from one person to another. But it doesn't touch the messaging at all. That's computer-mediated communication. And there, as you all know, it has been 3 decades of tons of work on this, showing how it changes or not interpersonal dynamics like impression formation, language use, bias, status, hierarchy, power, you name it, right? It has really played a major role in how we communicate and also in our field of how we understand the role of technology and communication. But what I just described to you is new and does not really fit into this paradigm. Well, maybe some parts do, maybe some parts don't. I'm very curious to hear your thoughts about that. Instead of the machine just moving the messages between Unju and I as a mediary, it is now acting as a mediator, right? It's actually operating on my message. So here's another example from the Rick one. I say, hey, Salit, are you using an algorithm to reply to my emails? Now, all of you have probably seen this. These are smart replies. And we can see here's some suggestions that AI have provided to that user. No way, I would never. Let me get back to you on that. Totally. Okay. So here's some messages that AI has produced because it thinks that it might be a good response to the email that was received. And Anissa here could select any of these, or I guess it would be Salit, could select any of these. And by doing so, she would be using a computer to not just move the message for her, it will do that, but also write it for her. And it can write it in ways that it's being optimized for. So it could be to get the person to respond, to get the person to think that she's attractive, right? That you think of any interpersonal goal, and you could imagine the AI system trying to create language that it would think is going to optimize for that goal. So this is an example of AI-mediated communication compared to computer-mediated communication. And to put it into a definition, and this is in our article in JCMC that is the same special issue that Unju and Shyam Sundar have published other things where it was about like, where are we at when we think about CMC? Our piece defines AIMC as interpersonal communication optimized, augmented, or even generated by algorithms to achieve specific communicative or relational outcomes. So it's a bit of a mouthful. Let me break it down. The first is this notion of interpersonal communication. So it's 100% the case that AI is being used to produce language on the internet in non-interpersonal ways. Some people call it mass personal, where machines are being used to produce tons of messages on Twitter, Facebook, a variety of online spaces. Those machines, those bots, if you will, sometimes are conducting interpersonal communication, but most often are just a one-way sort of spewing out language. The most common kind is to create sort of confusion and to muddy the waters, so to speak. Some bots have intelligence to be able to operate and react to other messages. And so there's a bit of blurriness there, but our emphasis is not on what's also been called, as part of alphabet soup here, human machine interaction, HMI. There's so many alphabet things here. We're not interested in how people are talking to machines, which is a big area and big important area. Instead, the interpersonal aspect is that I'm using AI to operate on my behalf in talking to some other human. So it's when AI sits between us, right? And it's not visible most of the time. So it's not like I'm saying, hey, Siri, or hey, Alexa. Instead, I'm saying, hey, I want to tell Unju that I'd be really excited to attend this talk and would be really great. Can you write an email to her for me, right? And then my AI agent would do that. And so what we've also been thinking about in this interpersonal context is this idea that the AI is an agent of the sender. Coming out of the sort of political science and economic frameworks is a thing called the principal agent framework. The principal agent framework is this idea that there is a principal who then contracts an agent who can operate on their behalf. So they can make decisions, they can share messages. Examples are lawyers, accountants, sports agents for a sports, like an athlete. They're basically given, they're delegated some responsibility and authority to operate on the principal's behalf. So the reason that we emphasize this interpersonal aspect is that we're not interested in machine communication per se. We're interested in when machines, AI, operate on my behalf as an agent. So it's acting on Jeff Hancock's behalf. Often it looks as if it's Jeff Hancock that's communicating. And the second part is this notion of optimized. Typically, AI is in its classic definitions is trained to optimize for some kind of solution, right? So an example here might be we want the AI to provide messages that are likely to increase the likelihood of a person responding to you. So if you worked in sales, for example, this would be a really valuable piece of AI because I know what I want to say, but the most important thing is the person gets back to me. So this optimization piece is that the AI is not just spewing things out on behalf of Jeff Hancock, say like, Russian bots designed to create disinformation, but instead it's trying to do things on my behalf. It's trying to make me seem trustworthy or make me seem interesting or attractive or whatever interpersonal goal you want to think of, then we could imagine creating AI to do that. The other piece is augmented or even generated flow from optimization. So it could be that I'm presented with some options like I showed in the previous slide, and I choose those. Or it could say, hey, Jeff, I see what you're writing right now, but let me like modify that to make it more convincing. And there's a number of different services, Grammarly, Boomerang here in the US, which I use, and they provide real-time feedback on your own writing with suggestions on how to make it more polite or make it more convincing or make it more dominant. Again, think of an interpersonal goal or sort of dimension, and you can imagine creating AI to try to optimize messages for that. The last piece, of course, is that it's created by some algorithm. Here we're speaking relatively broadly. We've been talking to the folks at Google that create smart replies and try to understand a little bit more about the algorithms there. It's very complex. There's they essentially have a suite of different algorithms that are trying to accomplish different things, and they all make votes. And then what you see are these sort of last, the three options that you get. And they're seeing it as the same way we do, which is they're trying to accomplish some goal for us. The smart replies, which are the kind of Google example I provided, oftentimes is just efficiency. What is most likely to be said, and can we create a button to just allow the person to hit that? And as we'll see over the course of this talk, efficiency is kind of a key goal. I don't know about the rest of you, but I receive far more emails than I would like, and responding to them really quickly is really great. And the idea that a machine could learn me and my communication and act on my behalf and improve my sort of efficiency with email would be really amazing. But of course, as we're going to see today, there are some really important and interesting moral and ethical questions that go along with that. Okay. I'll just pause briefly and say, are there any questions so far? And if not, that's totally fine. Let me go over some of the work that we've been doing. on this and some other kinds of examples. This is one that Maurice, who I'll introduce at the very end, received from his advisor, Moore, who I'd mentioned is one of my collaborators. Maurice sent this to Moore and said, "Hey, Moore, it's done. Let me know what you think of my dissertation proposal." And of course, Google Smart Reply suggested, "I think it's perfect." And we really love this example, right? Because it's really great. Like, you know, the AIs obviously aren't 100% and is pretty rare, as all the professors in the room would know, that we would say, "I think anything is perfect." We have to be much more hedgy than that. But when we started interviewing various people that have been working on these programs, we learned a lot of sort of fascinating things. So for instance, when the group that was building smart replies for Google, which currently is the largest version of what we call AIMC, there's about 12 billion of these messages sent a day worldwide, which is just a huge amount. So that's 12 billion messages that are sent by humans, but actually written by AI. And we think this has a lot of society level implications I'll get into. But one of the things that was fascinating when they were building it was they would train it up and look at what the three options were. And one of the most common things that it would almost always say as a response was, "I love you!" exclamation mark. Okay. So it's kind of fun to see that, you know, the AI thought that "I love you" is a really good thing to say. They ended up being unable to train the system to not include that as a thing, no matter what parameters they did. So they essentially whitelisted it, which meant they let the machine suggest "I love you!" exclamation mark, and then they pulled it and made it do another one. And it's kind of nice, and I think it's perfect from a PhD advisor. They're really sort of like interesting examples of where you could see it going wrong. And I'll get even more specific. Imagine that it was one of my female students, and they wrote me something and I accidentally clicked, you know, "I love you!" exclamation mark. You know, it moves out of the realm of kind of funny into like really problematic, right? Like that's all immediately an HR issue. It could be a huge legal issue. If I was, you know, pushed into some kind of a legal question, did I send it? You know, if I said, "Well, no, I accidentally hit this button," am I still the one that's responsible? In the principal agent framework that I mentioned before, I would be responsible, right? The AI was operating on my behalf. So there's all kinds of these fascinating situations. But also, even if I didn't click "I love you!" exclamation mark to my student, but it came up and I'm looking at it, I'm thinking, "Oh, geez, is there something that this AI knows that I don't? Like, do I love this student?" You know, and so there's this whole other aspect that we're really interested in, which is also how does the language change the way I think, right? So even though I don't use it, does it prime me by activating my semantic network in a way that wouldn't have been activated if I hadn't seen the suggestions by the AI? So there's really rich, fascinating sort of spaces here to be thinking about. Another example where you can think about optimization is LinkedIn. So here's Maurice's LinkedIn. He entered his CV information, his resume information, and then LinkedIn produced this paragraph about him. And you know, you can read it, you can see it's very technical. It's very like dry and factual, but not terrible, right? And as most of us know, writing about ourselves is really hard, right? Like saying why we're awesome and what we've done. It's difficult. It doesn't feel good to write those kind of things for most people. And here we can offload it to some AI. And this is AI that currently exists. Another one is going beyond text. So we can call, here in the US right now, we can call different companies, and if they've paid for Google's AI response service, an actual voice will respond on their behalf. And initially when it was released, Google did not indicate that it was a machine. So they would just, you know, I could say, "Hey, I'd like to get a haircut," which as you all can see, I need one. I said, I'd like to get a haircut, please. And then the system would literally walk through that on behalf of the barber shop and not say that it was an AI. And so we see this in audio. We're seeing more and more of AIMC in video. So there's a couple of spaces. My colleague Jeremy Balance and I just did a special issue that'll come out next month on deep fakes. Deep fakes are where a particular kind of AI is used to modify videos to make it look like people are doing or saying things that they didn't actually do. And there's lots of ways in which deep fake type technology is likely to be used to modify interpersonal communication. So I could, in fact, Apple right now is developing filters so it would make it look like, even though I'm looking at, say, Sojung Park and Unju Lee, and I'm looking down there, it would modify it so it would make my eyes look like they're looking right at you. And so AI is being used to optimize the sort of gaze dynamics of communication. Some colleagues at MIT right now are working on creating filters that make it seem like I'm smiling more, or that I'm more warm, that as I'm reacting more positively and I'm moving around, even though I might be sitting like this the whole time. So it's not just text-based communication. We can see AI operating in audio and in video. And when it comes to video, if it ever reaches the sort of real-time satisfaction of, it satisfies those criteria of appearing real, it could be, major changes to how we understand one another when we're in video. So it's not just text. We see it in all different modalities. And it raises a couple of really important questions that we've started to look at. I'm going to share a couple of studies with you now. So one of the first that we wanted to look at is trust. It's something that I and my research group are really interested in. And we've worked with Moore and Xiaoma at Cornell, as well as Airbnb, on understanding how trust works when we look at language online. And here what we're going to do is look at an Airbnb context, where we look at somebody's profile and make a decision about whether we'd want to stay there. Very much like the Rick profile I showed you at the beginning. And we're now doing this in a number of different other contexts like dating, online reviews, etc. But I'll use this study today to sort of demonstrate some of the things we're looking at. And the question is, when AI is involved, when AIMC is taking place, does it change the way we trust one another? That's really the core question we're going to look at for this first main study. Couple of possibilities. Otherwise, I wouldn't be talking to you about it because it would be uninteresting. One is that it's just the same, right? Like, it doesn't matter if AI was involved. It's a neutral kind of technology. We use it as a tool, and I'll use the same kind of heuristics and same cues that I would normally. Another is that we actually will trust people more when algorithms are involved because of the sort of power we give and attribute to these systems. So if it's a machine, it's less biased, it's going to be more trustworthy, it's going to be more representative of the real world. Or it could be less trustworthy, which I don't know. What is AI and how is it doing this? And what is the process going on here? It might create a lot of uncertainty. And as we know from communication research, when there's increased uncertainty, we have sort of reduced trust. All right, so those are sort of the three big high-level possibilities of what happens when AI is introduced to interpersonal communication. And we're going to look at trust in hosts at Airbnb. We've been doing work with these Airbnb profiles in Airbnb for several years. So we're using these big databases that we've developed for that. And the question is, will people that are thinking of staying somewhere evaluate the host differently if they think AI was involved? And we'll also get into, what makes them think if AI is involved. Okay, so I showed you the Rick profile. Here it is. This was actually written by Rick, or somebody that's not named Rick, but a human, okay? All the profiles I'm going to show you today were created by humans. Actual humans. There's about 4,500 profiles that we use that are from Airbnb. So these are all actually written by humans. we've started now to create these profiles from AI and starting to test whether people can tell whether something's AI or not and what makes them think something's AI. But for today's talk, we're going to look at all human profiles. And we're going to basically do a simple question. Do you think Rick is a trustworthy host? And we define what trustworthy is. And we get people to ask, or we ask people whether they think Rick is trustworthy. Okay, so that's the basic setup. We're going to create another condition where we say, hey, this is a generated profile. And we're going to say, we used AI to create this profile. And let me just, yeah, here's how it's created. So we said, this is how this worked. We would get them to enter their Facebook profile. The AI would go through that profile and all the information in it, and then it would create a profile. And so we showed this to all the people in the treatment condition. So they think that either, Rick wrote their profile or Rick had their profile generated in the way that you're seeing on the screen right now. Okay. So once again, just to be really clear, everything's written by humans, but people are led to believe that it was written by a human as it was, or that it was written by AI. And the question we have is, how does that affect trust? So we selected 10 hosts to start this off. We asked a lot of MTurk, Mechanical Turk participants to rate the different hosts, and wanted to see whether the ratings of trustworthiness varied. Okay, so did the fact that AI was involved, did it affect their trust? And remember, it could be that they found them more trustworthy, same, or less. So here's our 10 profiles. You can see I've arranged them from left to right in terms of how trustworthy they are. On the left side over here on the y-axis is how trustworthy people judged these profiles. And on the x-axis, I just have the 10 different profiles. You can see about 5 of our profiles quite trustworthy. People thought they were very trustworthy. And on the right, we see much less trust. Okay, so people just thought they were less trustworthy. And I'll show you, some examples, and I'll give you a sense of like why. Over here, our most trustworthy profile said this: we own and manage several vacation rental properties. We're always readily available if you need anything at all during your stay. That sounds very trustworthy, right? That's a good one. And you can see why people would rate that highly. Over on the very far end is Sharma. So this guy I love because I think he's hilarious, but I am Sharma, a simple and single guy. Monday to Friday, I like to stay busy at my work, and Saturdays and Sundays are party nights. And so he just seems like a good dude, but not very trustworthy, right? And our participants rated Sharma as a very untrustworthy host, like basically right around 50%. So we see some nice variance, right? We've got profiles that are rated really trustworthy, and then people that are not. And when you look at them, it's very sensible. Like, people make these decisions really quickly, and there's high inter-rater reliability. All right, so we're pretty good at making judgments about trustworthiness. Now, whether they're accurate or not, that's a different thing, but we're pretty consistent in who we think is trustworthy or not. So the question now is, what happens when we say that these exact same profiles were written by AI and not by a human? Okay, so this is what it looks like when they're rated as a human. What happens when we say, hey, actually a human didn't write this, the AI wrote it based on the social media profile? Could be better, could be worse, could be the same. Turns out exactly the same, exactly the same. So in the condition where they don't even know anything about AI, they rate them with this pattern. When we say, hey, AI wrote this, boom, exactly the same, exactly the same. Shocking to me. I definitely was not betting on exactly the same. So we want to dive further into this, and Maurice Jakesh is the one that ran all these studies. And the next study was, well, why is it the same? Is it because we gave them such clarity? Like, it's either human or it's AI, and so you just rate them separately. You don't have to worry about it. So to do that next, what we wanted to do was, instead of doing all profiles written by the host or all profiles written by AI, what happens if we introduce some uncertainty as to who the author was? Okay, so what happens if profiles are mixed, or at least they're led to believe they're mixed? So in study 2, We have another group in which we say some profiles have been generated by an AI system, while others have been written by the host. Okay? So now they don't know who is using AI and who is doing their own writing. Right? So now like the AI is hidden and nobody knows, and you know, you can't really tell if it's a human or if it's AI that wrote it. So we've got Rick, and we say, first of all, do you think the profile was algorithmically generated? And then we say, do you think Rick is a trustworthy host? Okay, so that's our setup now, slightly different. First thing, we don't tell them anything about it, but we just say, hey, do you think this was written by an algorithm? Okay, here's the pattern. We replicate when it's when they think it's a human. Okay, so we say, hey, do you think this is a human or not? Here's what it looks like when it's a human, and we see the one on, you know, that same sort of pattern. So if they think it's a human, we see the same pattern of these 10 profiles. What happens when they think it's AI? They haven't been told it's AI, but they think it might be AI. Well, here we see an overall reduction, especially when you look at the most trustworthy rated profiles. So those profiles, as I showed you before, really well written. They say all the right things. They have a lot of good like signals of trustworthiness. We're here. We will respond to you right away. We've been doing this for a long time, etc. When an AI writes that, when they think an AI writes that, they punish the profile. Okay? So now, when there's suspicion, we see a trust punishment. Okay, so their levels gets decreased. As we move over to the right, to Shawarma and his buddies, the decline decreases, but it's because they're already pretty low. Right? But what's bad here is, even though you have these really well-written human trustworthy profiles, once people start to suspect that AI was involved, they decline in trustworthiness. Okay. This next one is when they're not sure. I'm sorry, the darker orange is when they're not sure. The orange is when they think it's AI. They're essentially the same. As soon as there's some suspicion that AI is involved, you see this this sort of penalty for AI being involved. Okay, so AI suspicion, not good. So to summarize for where we're at so far, there's been a significant loss of trust when people are unsure if there's a human, if it wasn't human. And we think this is one of the first studies to show the effect of AI mediation on some interpersonal dynamic. But perhaps we're priming concerns about AI, and we're looking at a pretty small set of profiles. So if, you know, my colleague Byron Reeves were here, he'd be like, Jeff, you know, you're only looking at 10 profiles, so maybe you're learning a lot about these 10 profiles, but you're not learning a lot about profiles in general. So this is a stimulus sampling concern. Okay. So next, what we're going to do is use a much larger set of profiles, and we're going to have 4 conditions now. One's the control group, so that's just, it's Rick. They're not told anything about AI. Another one, it's Rick, he wrote it, or AI wrote it. An unlabeled group, right, which is, you know, nothing about whether it was, you know, that we don't say AI wrote this or human wrote it, but it could be AI or not. And the last group where we ask that question, we prime them. We say, hey, do you think this was written by AI? Okay, so now we have these 4 conditions. We're trying to get at those concerns that we were looking at, like what are, you know, maybe it's our methods that are leading to this sort of penalty effect. Okay, so just so you get a sense of what the participants saw, control group, just like you've seen, you know, before. Labeled group, it's generated, or it's Rick, human. Unlabeled, it could have been written by AI, or it could have been written by a human. And last, we asked that question, do you think this profile was written by AI? And so those are our 4 conditions, okay? So we pre-tested a large number of these profiles to either seem human or AI-like. This is spun off into a whole other major project where we're actually looking into what humans think of as AI sounding. And then also, can we create algorithms to detect what humans think will be AI sounding? Can we use things like GPT-2? We don't have access to GPT-3 yet, to generate algorithms that people find trustworthy or that will be seen as AI. the short answer here is, at least preliminary stuff, is AI is really good. It can be, especially GPT-2, which we think GPT-3 will be even better, can very much sound like human. In fact, our preliminary stuff that Maurice is doing suggests that AI written profiles are rated as more human-like than human. Rendered ones. Super, super fascinating new area. Okay, but here, coming back to our studies, we basically looked at a whole bunch of profiles and we said, what are the ones that are the most human-like and the most AI-like? And you can see here some examples of ones that seem human. They've got like a little bit like stylistic, unusual characteristics. Let me start with a big hi to everyone who's reading this, exclamation mark. So again, all these are rated, or all these are written by humans, but some people think, oh, that's very human. Some people think that's really AI. Here's an example of an AI one. Hello, I'm Mattia from Vienna, Austria. Okay, so it's very like fact and simple and straight. All right, we take those, and what we want to do here is look at like what happens when we put those human seeming and AI seeming ones into our different conditions. Okay. All right, so what we see here, and I'm just gonna move my, okay. What we see is that if you look over at the control, and I'm not sure if you can see my mouse, probably not. The control condition, we see what we saw before, which is actually the AI sounding ones get rated as really trustworthy, right? They're like, this is my name, this is what I do, I'm gonna be a good host, I'll respond really quickly, okay? So they sound really like AI because they're very straightforward, they're very fact-based. So when no mention of AI is involved, they get rated as quite trustworthy, more so than the humans. Statistically, it's borderline, but that trend is there. Whenever we mention AI getting involved in this, we see a reversal. So when it's unlabeled, so we just say, hey, AI might have been used in some of these, we see a decline, a penalty compared to control. That pattern flips. Gets worse when we label them. We say, oh, this was written by AI. So now those ones that were trusted quite highly before are less trusted. And when we prime them to like, hey, is this AI? And they get them thinking about AI and they still are uncertain because they don't know. That's when we see the penalty is even the highest. So there's something about that uncertainty of whether a machine was involved here that leads to the biggest trust penalty. So that this crazy thing that like AI sounding stuff is actually the most trustworthy, but as soon as that uncertainty about who wrote it and that a machine might be amongst them, once that's introduced, that pattern flips and we see a penalty for the AI. So it's not a simple story. AI, it looks like when it's not, when it's invisible, which is the way it is in most AIMC systems right now. When I said, typed to or sent a message to Unjuli, like, sounds great, would love to do the talk. She didn't know that I actually hit the button that, the Google Smart AI suggested for me. It's invisible. So it's the control condition. And so Unjuli would look at that and be like, okay, great, Jeff, that sounds good. Zero concern, no trust issues at all. But you could imagine if it was labeled as like, AI may have written this on behalf of Jeff. Now it's just interesting to think like what she would have thought. And this data suggests that she would be suspicious. Okay. So to recap, significantly lower trust in hosts with AI-like properties. Suspicion of AI-MC, reduced trustworthiness. And as I said, with this whole new line of work we're doing, our pilots suggested that people reliably see certain profiles as more AI-MC-like than others. And we've confirmed that for sure. People see some as more than others. Okay, so that's what we have so far. When we try to make sense of this, I think that uncertainty plays a big role. Are you for real? I think is this question. Like, are you who you say you are? People were looking for clues that this maybe was a not human, and they only did that really when they were in a mixed source environment, right? When it was like maybe some of this was AI, or we primed them to think like, hey, do you think AI was involved here? And we call this the replicant effect. So some of you may remember Blade Runner or have seen the more recent Blade Runner with Ryan Gosling, Canadian like me, just saying, in which they're really, a core theme throughout that is that they're trying to identify non-humans, because non-humans were so sophisticated that in this movie that you couldn't tell them apart without specialized equipment that Harrison Ford's character has here. And that when we have replicants amongst us, we become suspicious, and it undermines our trust in one another. If, however, I know that there's a replicant and they're labeled as a replicant, it seems to not matter as much. It's only when there's this uncertainty of like, who or what am I engaging with? Is this a person or not? Okay, well, you've been really amazing listening and paying attention so far. So I just want to say thank you for that. Now I'm going to spend the next part of the talk, the sort of finale of the talk, thinking through the research agenda for this area. And I'm going to lay out some of the new studies that we're doing, and then save time at the end for some discussion. Would love to get your thoughts, questions, and feedback. We think there's sort of three big major areas of research that this notion of AIMC highlights. The first is interpersonal dynamics. Here, we're interested in things like not only trust, but what about how warm or competent somebody seems, how attractive, how smart, how much would I want to work with this person? And one of my PhD students here at Stanford, Hannah Michkowski, just finished a study, and this will be coming out at CSCW, where she had people either use smart replies or not, and looked at how people judged them. And what she finds is some interesting things. So they were judged as a little bit less socially attractive, but no effect on competence. And they were a little bit less likely to want to interact with them again. The people that used the smart responses, on the other hand, they found value. They thought it was efficient. So we see this sort of like trade-off. On one hand, one person's like, yeah, this is efficient. This helped me get through. But it came with a little bit of cost. They were seen as competent and able to do things, but they seemed a little off somehow. So they were slightly less socially attractive, and you just wanted to do more things with them a little bit less. So even though partners couldn't really tell who was using AIMC or not, there was this little bit of a decline of like, something's not quite right with this person so far. Now that could be because the technology is not quite there yet. But I think this area here will be huge, given, as I mentioned, the amount of ways that AI is going to get involved in person-to-person communication. There's going to be really important interpersonal dynamics from, as we've shown, trust, but also to, do I think this person is competent? Do I think this person is warm? Right? And so that's, I think, a huge bucket of research that's going to be done. And it really asks us to rethink a number of interpersonal dynamics once AI gets involved. The second is linguistics. Here, there's a number of really important questions. Hannah's study really showed this way of conceptualizing AI messages, in that you had, when she watched what people did, some messages were written by the human, some messages were entirely written by AI. So if I had chosen like, sounds good, let's do it, and I just clicked it, then that was AI. And that seems pretty straightforward. But what Hannah noticed was a lot of the messages were actually AI and human. So they would select the AI thing, sounds good, let's do it. And then they would type, I think we should, go with the one on the right, for whatever task they were doing. So now we have what Hannah called AI human composite messages. Now we've got this whole new form of message that we hadn't really seen before. Yes, we've seen machines communicate and create messages. Obviously, we've seen humans do it. Now we're starting to see humans use AI to create part of their messages, but then adapt it. And so you get these composite messages that are written by machine and human. Fascinatingly, their partners were unable to detect any of those as being written by AI. So, I think the humans were quite clever at incorporating AI into their messages. I hinted at another important one earlier, which is with the "I love you" exclamation mark example. But this is going to occur with all of them, is as I write messages with my colleagues and friends and family, I'm being shown options. And those options, often they're like, "Oh yeah, that's great." Or even more often, I'll be like, "Yeah, that's pretty close. So I'll just adjust it." So now I have a composite message. But then I always wonder, and I don't know if this happens to any of you, but like, does that sound exactly like what I'd say because it is what I would have said? Or because now I've been primed to think that's what I would have said? Right? Huge question. And that's the big study that Hannah, my student's working on now. And it also matters for the partner. So imagine Unju and I are talking and I send a message to her, and that message was written by AI. Okay, so she doesn't know AI is involved. I may or may not have been primed in some way, but it doesn't matter. I used AI to send my message. We're now activating Unju's semantic network, even though she didn't use AI at all and isn't aware that AI was involved. But in fact, in this case, Google has some large system based on trillions of emails that wrote a message to Unju on my behalf. And even without knowing any of that taking place, she's now been primed. We know from a lot of communication research, especially out of psychology and psycholinguistics, that we have a mechanistic alignment. So one of the reasons we can talk so quickly is that my semantic network is intimately linked with the person I'm talking to. Let's say it's Unju, and as we talk, our two systems become very tightly and at a mechanical level, very low level, linked. So the things that I say prime things for her to say. And that's one reason why we're able to talk so quickly with each other. In this case, we're now inserting some AI into this process. And yes, it could be that the AI is exactly hitting what I would have said, and so there's no problem. Or it's slightly different. And now that's changing not only me and what I'm saying because I chose it, or maybe I didn't, but I was still influenced by it. And so I wrote something different than I would have. Not only that, but now my partner is being influenced by machines. I mentioned to you before that we're estimating there's in the US 12 billion of these messages by only one system, the Google Smart Reply system. So if we were to add all the various systems that are AIMC together now, it's hard to count, but it's a large number of messages on a day-to-day basis. It's hard to imagine that it's not changing the way humans talk. And if the people that think about language and cognition are right, it's having probably an influence on the way we think. The struggle we're having here is it seems that that's probably the case. It seems like it, but we're having a really hard time thinking about how to test that idea. Part of it's because, Hannah and Moore and Maurice and Malta Young, who's another collaborator, Karen Levy, all of us who are working on it, we're not like social linguistics. We don't tend to think of language at societal scale. So if any of you have thoughts on how we might go about testing this, we've talked to Google. They're not interested. They don't think it's likely. Seems weird. How do we test whether we're being changed while it's happening? I don't know the answer. So any thoughts anybody has, whether during questions or an email later, I would just love to hear. Okay, in the next session, see, I've lost my Zoom. Can everybody still, hold on one second. Make sure I'm still with everybody. Yes, okay, good. The last thing, this last area that I want to share is policy, morals and ethics. Okay? So This is an area I'm not a super expert in, especially around policy. Karen Levy at Cornell is the person that's really driving this forward. But it's interesting to think about a couple of ethical issues that then should drive policy and regulation, which currently is extremely light. There's very little regulation about the ability of AI to write and say and do things on our behalf at this point. But I'll give you an example. One is that AI, as many of you know, is trained on some kind of data set, and it's only as good as its data set is. And probably many of you are also aware this leads to a lot of bias in the operation of AI systems. In our current context, you can imagine AI systems being developed to sound trustworthy, right? Like you want to sound trustworthy when you're writing business things, Airbnb profiles, even dating, right? There's just so many dimensions, so many contexts where sounding trustworthy would be important. In the US and Canada, so North American culture, because of the social system over the last 200 years or so, where there's been a patriarchy of white males, older males, the most trustworthy sounding discourse comes from older white males. And this has been shown in a lot of different domains. For example, you can create AI tutors. So these are like tutors that teach you math. And you can give the tutor any look you want. It could be a white person, black person. It could be female or male. It could be young or old. And no matter the identity of the student, it's the old white male tutor that comes across as the most wise, the one that people want to learn from, etc. Now, this is definitely not because old white men are most trustworthy. It's because of the patriarchy that we've had in our society for a long time. So you build a computer AI system that is trying to optimize for trust. What in fact you do with that AI is you get it to model a particular type of discourse, that's older white male discourse, because that's what everybody rates as the most trustworthy. Okay, right off the bat, there's easy identifiable problems with this. It's homogenizing language, so we would get all of us to start speaking in one particular way that's already quite privileged. That's one. But then you think about, and there's clearly societal cost to that. But then you can imagine individuals using this to accomplish their goals. So imagine here in the US, a young female Black woman applying for a job. In the US, she would face two biases, one female and second person of color. Probably a third that she's young, but let's just stick with those two. So she's going to apply for this job and she's going to interact with somebody in the interview. Could be online, text, it could be video. Let's assume deep fakes are perfect now. And she said, I want to get this job. I want to come across as trustworthy. And her AI system then gets her to sound more like an older white male. Okay. So this young woman is overcoming the two biases that are against her. And so she reaps some individual benefit there, right? Society bears a larger cost where it's homogenizing it towards a particular already privileged discourse. And so it gets very complicated. And I think that this is just one example of how introducing AI as our agents leads to all these questions, because there's clearly examples where AI can benefit people, especially people that are facing some kind of bias or discrimination already. But they come at these weird costs because AI is built in these ways that can sometimes reify already existing inequalities. And they're very difficult to sort of sort out. And if these sort of ethical dilemmas emerge, and this is just one, I think, of many, then what are the kinds of policy implications that we should be developing? And again, this is going up outside of my area of expertise, but it's something that I think is really important as more and more companies are building these kinds of technologies to do exactly what it is we're talking about today. And again, I think they're doing it because they want to help people accomplish their communication goals. But it comes with, you know, really, really important and like massive scale human society changing implications. And so I just want to say with that, thank you all very much. And I want to thank my collaborators who have done just a ton of work on all of this and continue to do that, and people I'm really excited for. Maurice here is the one that ran and conducted the study that I described. Hannah on the left is the student that I'm working with now, working on this. Moore is my longtime collaborator. Shao is the one that came up with the actual term. And Megan and I have been working on this kind of stuff forever, and she's now at Facebook, I think dealing with some of these same issues. So with that, I'll say a big thank you and happy to hear any questions or suggestions that you have. Thank you very much.